everybody. Welcome to what we're doing here is an American prophecy review and synopsis. It's an abbreviated form of everything that we've covered previously. And basically all we're doing is summarizing so we could kind of take something that's kind of expanded. And there's a lot of elaboration and condense it into something that's a little more digestible. And maybe you could kind of use this almost as an intro or an outline of basically what we're covering. So this is important. Just kind of, it's more of something that you can just listen to. You don't have to watch my face or anything. This is just, I'm not going to be going over specific verses. I'm going to allude and give you basically a synopsis of what we've gone over. The first thing we really started to focus upon is American prophecy regarding how it works out in the prophetic timeline. Hey, Joseph, shalom to you too. Peace, God's peace. The timeline and how the book of Revelation works. And you have the 1260 quote year day, and it's all kind of built in the Leviticus 25 system. When you're looking at prophecy, huge recommendation, do what Daniel did. He used the Levitical outline of feast, jubilee, the various kind of concept of releasing of prisoners year for day, Leviticus 25 kind of a stuff. So that's to kind of help you of like, the orientation of the prophets. All the prophets were looking at temple measurements. When they measure temples, such as Ezekiel or etc., they're using temple measurements. The temple is a prophetic model for us to look at. And that's what they looked at because God measures everything according to the temple, to the courtyard, to the altar, etc. You see this throughout the book of Revelation. The prophetic book of all prophetic books, we're talking about the superstar of all prophetic books, is the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation definitely has the sanctuary outline to it. And that is your template for understanding prophecy. We really want to square you off and to orientate you towards this. God, basically set his glory up in a diminished form so we could look upon it and observe it in the pattern and the model of the sanctuary service. Very essential that you just do not dismiss the sanctuary model. And so when you're looking at the year-day principle, that's all out of Leviticus 25 and measuring of days of atonement. That is the ultimate kind of clock reference, 12 o'clock hour type of a thing, in which you kind of measure everything according to the Day of Atonement and the concept of bondage and release and etc. That's just for, the heady students that like to get into all the minutiae of this thing. But what we looked at is the time prophecy that is in Revelation, in which you're seeing in Daniel, basically, fundamentally, you're seeing this outline of Day of Atonement. It is the Moed Getz. It is the, quote, fall festival. And that constitutes what we call in Christian circles and people that preach or teach the end times. The end times. It is basically the Moed Getz. It is the end of time and is the sequence of ministerial, priestly, sanctuary events that Christ does in heaven. And then there is satanic rebellion and correlation that goes on earth. This is fundamentally how prophecy is really biblically understood. And so when you get into the quote, the 1260 days or 42 months or this 3.5 years of prophetic days, which is 1260 years. And you see this entire spread laid out over the medieval church from 538, in which is the beginning of the Justinian Code. That is where church and state now unite. God's prophetic people now unite with the state, and it becomes an earthly dominion, not unlike everything we've just been covering in regard to the building up of cities. When Cain wandered into Noah and set up a city after the name of his son, he gives dominion over to his son. Any parallels there? And it's called Enoch. And then from Enoch is where you get the development of the superstate system, in which Lamech does a 70 times 7 reference. Hello, this whole 490, etc., this prophetic kind of a piece in which man is now carrying out kingdom and dominion upon this earth vis-a-vis God, at war with God, even though it is a template and likeness of the kingdom of God in heaven. It is now what Satan does, which is counterfeit the entire system And then even Satan himself presents that before Christ as a temptation because it is a likeness unto the kingdom of heaven. So you had the playing out of Cain, Enoch, not the Enoch that walked with God, but from the line of Cain to Lamech. And then you had the men of renown and all of this. And then you had the deconstruction that happened with the sons of God that were in covenant with Seth versus the daughters of men. And then, so there's no more distinction. And then there is now the deconstruction, the entire process. Every time the church and state, every time God's people mingles with the empires of the dominions of this world, it is definitely the picture of the abomination of desolation. And you saw it through other apostasies, but it's when the priesthood does it. You saw that in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 8, 9, when the priesthood finally links the sanctuary service on earth with the powers of this earth, it becomes an abomination that causes desolation. Absolutely made clear, and God has to deconstruct everything. Even Christ himself refers to the abomination of desolation when the disciple says, when you take over the kingdom, we get the buildings. And Christ says, no, not going to happen that way. They're going to unite church and state. There's going to be abomination that causes desolation. And so the interests of the God of this age, man, the heart of man, the pride of man, is going to unite with that which is a light and a beacon of God's kingdom on earth and the proclamation of the gospel, which is God's kingdom and his kingdom people and the priesthood. That's what you're seeing the war in the book of Daniel is the sanctuary in heaven versus the dominion of Satan upon this earth. And it's this, quote, little horn power. As you see, this stout little horn power with eyes and mouth. And it's this whole rebellion against the dominion of God in heaven, establishing his own dominion on earth and looking to mingle or to cast or to deconstruct the temple in heaven, cast it to the ground, cast the truth to the ground, trample underfoot, and to deconstruct and to unite those two forces. Hey, good to see you, Vincent. So this is what we're talking about in the Justinian Code. That's what happened when the church had done that. And then you had the papal system. And then you had the 1260 years in which, to the exact year, from the establishment of the Justinian Code in which the church united with Empire Rome, that was at 538. Go look it up. Go look at the 4 different volumes that were established as the Justinian Code. And then finally, when you had 3 powers that were opposing, these were Protestant-like powers. You know, these were the Goths. And when they were basically the Ostrogoths, the Heruli, the Vandals were all cast out. Now is the establishment of the church state, and then you had what's called the Justinian Code. That Justinian Code was basically a globalist constitution for the interest of the church and to have dominion, this false counterfeit gospel, in union with the powers of the global powers of this world, which was medieval Rome. It turned into medievalism, the dark ages of 1260 years, and it was only broken through what? The Protestant Reformation, and how that started deconstructing, opening up the Enlightenment age in which people are getting access to libraries and books and science and etc. And the liberty, the whole Rem beast that we had covered, this Rem beast, this wild ox, this literally, it's translated buffalo in the Webster, I believe, or the Darby translation, because it's a buffalo. And it was always a picture of God's prophetic sign when he comes in and liberates. Breaks bondage, liberates. So you had Protestantism finally liberated from Europe, and you had the discovery of the new lands. And then you had the time prophecy that shows that there is an image that rises up from the land. And this is definitely using language from the 3rd day of creation, the 3rd day and the 6th day, because the 6th day is an image of God is created on the 6th day. And you have the correlation in creation week, summary. 1st day correlates to the 4th day. You have the light separates from darkness, and then you have the separation of sun, moon, and stars, and the various cycles of light and darkness. And then you had day 2, which is correlating with day 5, in which there is a separation of firmaments. And then on day 5, he fills the firmament, the obscure of the fish and of the birds. And then comes this, from the land rises an image, in which, in the Genesis account, It is man and beast. You have the same imagery being used in Revelation chapter 13. This from the land, image, man, beast, lamb-like, apostatizes and turns a beautiful situation, kind of like the Garden of Eden, into a hellscape of dominion. And so you had this picture of when Cain would not receive the humility, the chastisement, and the reproof, the counter that happened, what he did in reflex now was this: I'm going to make a great name for myself because I'm not going to come under the humbling rod of God. I will not provide the whole burnt offering that Abel had provided and come under the admission and the humility that I need an infinite sacrifice. I'm going to go and build a great kingdom after my own image, and everyone's going to bow down and worship me and deify me, and I'm going to sit on the throne of God as if I am God, reconstruct the throne of God, Nimrod style, doing exactly what Satan did in heaven and adopting and partaking of that same mind and spirit. How is American prophecy going to play into this? You will see that the United States of America is eschatological. God did not miss the ball on this one, guys, not even close. So after the 1260 years from 538 came a deadly wound to the beast and disabled it. That is exactly when the Justinian Code ended at 1260 years in its reign through the Church Roman Empire, in which you had the dominion and the doctrine of discovery and this idea of having full dominion over the whole world, 1492 stuff, in which the Reformation comes, defangs it, takes the spinal column out of the papacy, makes it a toothless paper dragon, and the final death knell is the Age of Enlightenment, and then ultimately when Napoleon came, and then the Napoleonic Code with independent states, and they have sovereignty, they rule themselves, and they have their own constitution, is exactly 1260 years after the establishment of the Justinian Code, and that was null and void, and now came what's called the Napoleonic Code, and that's when America rose. That was 1798. 1776, 1783, 1789, when we finally ratified our Constitution, all these processes, and right at the time of the liberty of the French Revolution, which was Satan's counterfeit of a true liberation, which was happening in the United States. Satan's doing it now. You have the French going off in some bizarre deconstructive kind of a thing, and people are cheering as if it is a liberty party. No, it is not. It is a counterfeit. Important to understand these things. So you had the establishment of medievalism, and then the death knell of medievalism, and then there's a promise in the book of Revelation chapter 13 that there is a neo-medieval resurrection. And we've gone over this in regard to how that came about in Europe, which was through the papacy being reestablished, right, in 1938, right around there, in which Mussolini had handed over the Vatican City, and now it's a global international nation state, a city nation state, the truly and literally running parallel to Washington, D.C. So you had literally the same kind of buildings, the same kind of architecture, the same kind of power center, and then you had these two imaging each other. And then so what gave the papacy its powers back? Well, it was a rebranded medievalism, and we call it now fascism, socialism, communism, globalism. It's just old school medievalism with new technological bells and whistles. This is what we've covered before. Very important to really comprehend this, that we don't believe what's being presented and marketed to us is just labels. We just get caught up in, well, they're not calling it medievalism, and anyone who's ever studied medieval law, medieval society, medieval governmental structure, its entire ability to communicate its authority throughout the entire world. I even had a book I'd spent almost $250 on just on how the papacy communicated itself globally through medievalism in a global market context and the history of that. Rare, great, wonderful research. That has been reestablished, and it took world wars to do it, for the buy-in. And finally, when America bought into the World War system and the war on terror was 1, 2, and 3 strikes are out, that's World War III. We've been in World War III. And this is this concept of this image rising, okay? So it starts off lamb-like, just like Solomon's kingdom. And so you saw the parallel in which we're talking about Solomon's kingdom. And we'll get more into that in just a sec. What I want you to see also in the book of Daniel is that the book of Daniel, when this time prophecy starts to play itself out in really from 1798 to 1844, there was this 46-year thing in which you had in the New Testament, hey, Jesus, we've been developing and building the temple for 46 years. Well, the same time kind of structure from the time in which there was the deadly wound to the Day of Atonement was this process of God preparing for, quote, the Day of Atonement. And that's when Christ showed up. Christ shows up ready for atonement. So in the book of Daniel, running these parallels here, when it comes to 1844 and the whole process between 1798 and 1844, all of a sudden the animals change in the book of Daniel. It's no longer an image that kind of runs parallel to everything. It's no longer these wild, unclean beasts that are predatory. These are all pagan powers. Now they are atonement animals. And then you have the jostling of power where fundamentally you have two fundamental powers upon this earth. And what you have is the he-goat, the Grecian he-goat, in which that is basically Hellenism is how the papal system really developed this entire academic and governmental structures. And then you had the ram, which is a two-horned animal, in which it's just like in the book of Revelation, in which it had two horn-like powers. And what's interesting and fascinating about this is that's when America rose up, and America basically structured itself after, and read the writings of Thomas Jefferson, after the model of Persia. Persia was the model for religious liberty, international commerce and trade, autonomy, independence, respect to civil liberty, respect to religious liberty, education, free education. It developed the library system, Persia, and developed the Pony Express. Wait a minute, that was in America? No, they started it. They started the governmental mail system, and that was modeled actually in Asia Minor, starting with Ephesus. And there's an interesting connection there. So what you have here is atonement animals. From the prophetic time clock of 1798 and 1888, you had this development of these two powers. Now, after the wound was inflicted, there was a remedy of this wound. And even though it looked like America, which is fundamentally a kind of a loosey-goosey version of a Protestant nation, it's not a Christian nation, but it bore Protestant-like principles of freedom and liberty, aided by Freemasonry, aided by all the other various, like the Jacobins and the various things like this. There was a kind of a tempering, and it became this world power in which Protestantism, the Bible, the gospel flourished as an image. Remember, it grew up from a land, not the sea. All the other animals came from the sea, but this one came from the land. The image beast always comes from the land, all the way from Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. Okay? So God's people are of the land. When they wiped out the Canaanites, we went through the doctrines of discovery, and that's basically the doctrines that America took when it came over, and all the European powers came over. They cited the doctrine of discovery and the papal encyclicals and bulls, and that gave it its medieval right to come and have dominion over this place. And fundamentally, the Catholics took second place. The he-goat became enraged with great choler, it says in the book of Daniel, in which the ram beast, which is a Persian religious liberty, because basically you can also liken the papal system, if you want to kind of look at the model of Daniel, to Babylon. Its doctrines all the doctrine throughout that image system is really Tower of Babel just kind of played out. But it was a Grecian like Alexander the Great power. The papacy had this kind of judgment, copper, bronze kind of a thing. And it just, it separated into, this entire kind of process in which it expanded itself into this kind of Hellenistic view of the world. All its academics are Hellenistic. But what's interesting is America took more of a Persian approach, a Cyrus approach, a messianic approach, a religious liberty approach. And as you see the history of Persia and the Medes and the Persians in the Bible, they become more corrupt as you're looking into the book of Daniel, as you're looking into the book of Esther. And that's where you get this idea of a death decree. It's coming out of Esther and this little horn power that is a Haman type power. And America's going to play that role. It's going to look to be a golem, an image. And so anyway, back to some more clues in American prophecy, and what we are using in the scripture to use as a template to understand this is the quote 666. And you saw in the 666 study is that it directly is quoting from the dominion of Solomon, in which he has now married many wives in his diplomatic strategy and his foreign policy strategy that was very whore-ish, that was very similar to how Babylon had its diplomacy, and started to marry these women and assimilate their gods. And he himself became globalist and idolatrous and materialistic and effeminized. Just study the history of Solomon. And then so he started to tax everybody with this 666 talents of gold, in which he had a total hegemony upon all the kingdoms of the earth, all the way down to the Cushites, all the way down to Sheba. And this is a very important thing, Sheba. His mother was named Bat Sheba, the house of Sheba. And the queen of Sheba showed up. And the Ethiopians showed up, and they were impressed with Solomon, and they submitted themselves to his wisdom and his government policies. And then Solomon became tyrannical and an oppressor. He became a dictator, harsh, exacting. And then with all that wealth and power came his downfall and his corruption and his idolatry. And then he did not follow the God of his fathers. And the nation went into a civil war. The Civil War turned into a division between the North and the South. Any parallels at all to the United States at all? That theme is carried over throughout the book of Daniel, all the way to Daniel chapter 11 and 12, where we have the king of the North and the king of the South, and all the parallels of this, quote, divided Israel kingdom, like with the Jerusalem. Or Judah, you would call it. And so you had this inner conflict that was always a point of exploitation. And then they went into this whole north-south paradigm, and the nation in conflict ended up deconstructing itself, where Babylon was able to come in and have dominion. And that is exactly paralleled in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, where the power was now handed over back to Babylon. Babylon rising, Babylon resurrected, Babylon having the Tower of Babel is now the nation of Babylon, and you had its dominion, and there was an abomination that causes desolation. It was the compromise of the gospel, the compromise of the 10 commandments, the compromise of the Shekinah glory. It was a national apostasy of the children of God, from leadership all the way down. And from that, God now handed them over to judgment. And Babylon now deconstruct not one. See if it sounds familiar to what Jesus said. Not one stone will be left upon another. Nothing in this institutional structure you should hold on to, because we're entering into the ultra, the preeminent abomination of desolation. And there won't not be a single stone left upon another when Christ returns in the clouds of glory. He will knock down every single thing that man has built and turn Earth into its original form of Toho Boho. Total guarantee. So I hope you're following kind of the theme that we're going with. Because you see that also in Revelation, this quote, image to the beast, lamb-like power that now turns into a re'em, this destructive power. It's translated in the King James in the Old Testament, this lamb-like beast. In the Old Testament as a re'em, it's a unicorn, but it says 2 horns. It is a prophetic beast that God used to liberate his people, and then it goes rogue. It becomes lawless and out of control, and now it becomes a scattering power, a destructive power, a diaspora power, in which God's people got to flee to the wilderness. And it's called a re'em. It's spelled R-E apostrophe E-M, or ram, a beast that was initially Christ-like, like Cyrus, and then you had Artaxerxes, and you have Darius, and so on. Before you knew it, it became a beauty pageant, and the book of Esther is born out of it, and a death decree, etc. Fascinating. So in the United States of America, its own deconstruction of Christianity and its own nemesis was birthed out of the United States of America, which is socialism, communism, fascism, was actually, yes, it's a brainchild of medievalism, but it was repackaged with Robert Owen and various other kind of transcendentalists that lived in the United States. It was repackaged as, look, we could create the kingdom of God in the book of Acts, and everyone's selling and not owning anything. And then they're all living in this kind of shared communism of the book of Acts, chapter 3 and 4 and 5. And the biggest sin is to hold back your property. Ananias and Sapphira. So people like Robert Owen, the various architects of communism, where you had Engels from Germany going to these places in which they created these villages and these communities and these communes, these kibbutz, these towns, in which these are these experimental little models of this whole thing. And he took it back to Germany to his friend Karl Marx, who I believe was a lawyer and a journalist. And then he basically says, wow, there's going to be the inevitable deconstruction of capitalism, and the world is going to turn into a giant, for its sustainability to be sustainable, it's going to have to be a giant commune. But that came from the United States. Socialism came from the United States. Fascism started from the United States. You had the fasci. Look at Congress, and you'll see the fasci and the fasci. But it was really medievalism eking its way in, and then just getting repackaged. Communism was coming from these transcendentalists that were post-Christians and say, look at all this new industrialism. It's an industrial revolution. And listen, we could all spread the wealth throughout the world. There never needs to have to be poverty or homelessness or war and everything else. And the only way to break people free of their greed is to create such conflict and war and destruction. We're going to have world wars. They said, well, how are we going to do that? Well, they're going to go out the medieval playbook. Remember, it's an image to the beast. And you're going to see the entire role that germs and guns and drugs and opiates and breaking down borders with like mass immigration and the breaking down this, and then what they call termiting societies and various other playbooks. In medievalism, well, this is what the CIA did all over the world. This is what United States foreign policy under wraps was doing, taking from the papal medieval playbook, and now it's an image to the beast. And then so what you have here is this other phenomenon happening, like you saw in the book of Esther, in the, quote, Persian times, and also during the Persian times in which the children of God, when it's Babylon has fallen, coming out of her, my people, and the reestablishment of the people of God that kind of happened in the United States, which is very fascinating. Go to the book of Nehemiah, and you will see Nehemiah and the book of Ezra, that one has a list of the sealed and one has a list of the marked. Any parallels? The phrase cannot buy nor sell comes from the book of Nehemiah, and it's around national reform and Sabbath reform. But it will be perverted and hijacked. It will be a lamb-like beast that will move into a great apostasy, such an apostasy that the only parallel is when God's people, after the coming out of Babylon and the reestablishment of the synagogue system, and you had the Second Temple, and then you had the synagogues that were teaching institutes all over Israel. And how did they set themselves up for the crucifixion of their own Messiah when everything they did was to set themselves up for the reception of the Messiah? And they studied the book of Daniel endlessly. And inadvertently, they found themselves being the very catalyst that will create such an ultimate abomination of desolation in which you literally murder God in the flesh. Is that not an abomination that will cause your desolation? And how is the eschatological, where you have the nation states and then you had the, quote, American prophecy scenario of all the parallelism that goes on there, that there's going to be a great global version of that? And that's where you get the concept of, as I said, the socialism, and then they call this world the new world. That this is the giant great reset. You're going to have a New Hampshire, a New York, a Newfoundland. You're going to have a New Mexico, a New Jersey, a new everything. So they call this the new world. With all the diversity and all the various, it's a land of opportunity in which it's not going to judge anybody, and everyone based on their own merits and their own skills that they bring to it. And they're going to have laws that is to be blind, that was the purpose, to anyone's color, creed, religion, gender, anything. And that if you just did what was in respect to the laws of the land, you should be able to prosper. And that's called the American dream, or the exceptionalism of America. Well, that was the hopes and idea, and that was the initial concept, but it becomes to be a speaking as a dragon power. It starts to become desperate to not lose its hegemony, that it becomes very desperate in its attempt to gain global control. And the only way to do that is to hand its power and its authority over to the original power, which is the medieval papal power. Fascinating. So anytime you're dealing with the theme, also back to America, and look, America as its giant, quote, mascot is the Statue of Liberty. This is the land of all the lands on all the planet. We have created an institution out of image worship. Image worship is the theme all the way from Hollywood to Washington, D.C., to social media, to the Statue of Liberty. And every single form and every single part of the spectrum of what image worship even means. It's not just statues, folks. It is trying to gain life and power and some form of projected kind of where you're imposing your qualities upon something that you bow down and worship, and then you try to rally other people to buy into that con job of worshiping something that doesn't give life, but it is akin to you because you want worship. Who leads the world of how and what the recipe of that looks like? And what does that, quote, Gollum picture? We've talked about that, how AI isn't Gollum. You could go Gollum, God Inc. There's great research on how what's happening is we are literally accruing and assembling and categorizing through servers and everything else on AI, this collective consciousness amongst humanity, very Platonic, and how America is really going to be the centerpiece of the worship of human wisdom. A beast, image beast that comes from the land, in which it's going to have all the instinctual kind of predatory powers of the amalgamated beast. And it's going to be an image to that. And it's going to cause those to not buy nor sell, and that they would kill those who do not have the mark and come under its dominion authority. And now mimicking all Gollums, if you read it, all Gollum stories where you have an image where you had the Wizard of Oz, or you had the Pinocchio, making his puppet, Giuseppe making his Pinocchio, or whatever else, when you build, or Dr. Frankenstein making his monster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what you thought was going to aid you by this empowered image monster now becomes the very catalyst and the very means of your destruction. Anytime you empower that image, and it's so to be a mirror of what Satan did to himself. He bowed down and worshiped an image of himself, and it's going to be the means of his own destruction, even though it accrued and curried power and leveraged power for himself. Now this monster's out of control, and he will die by his own image worship, in which he looked to bow down and have others bow down to him, wishing to possess and to covet that which is truly God's. And so the kings of the earth are all participating in this satanic, I'm going to make an image, and then I'm going to call people to validate it and to worship that image and to celebrate that image. And vicariously, I'm going to see that as a worship of me, and how that's going to leverage all this power for myself and all this glory and all this self-deification. It becomes a global phenomenon, and it's already happening, and it's nothing more than resonating with our own souls. I've made this clear throughout our studies. And that is the spirit of Cain. It breaks down to two parties at the end of time, folks. It's either Cain or Abel. You're either dust and nothing, which means really Abel, which means you are but dust, but powder, state of the dead. Recognizing your true nature and your true state and your true dependence upon God and your distinction from God. God is God. You're not God, psycho. No. And then Cain, who does not want to come under the reproof of the rod and says it's too much for me, wanders into the West like Clint Eastwood in the Man with No Name series, and then goes out and causes this conflict, and then he triumphs in the end, and everyone else is destroyed. And so you have this the march, what they call the March of God is what the communists call it, where it's a full takeover of the whole world of this kind of mentality that Satan had against God. Now you cast the truth to the ground, trample the sanctuary underfoot, and now you become the manifest realization of God in the flesh yourself. And that was the great sin of the papacy. They literally said, we are the second person of the Godhead. We are vicarious filii Dei. We are in reality God. And all the doctrines, all the mystical doctrines, all the transcendental kind of doctrines in which we become infused with divine essence and the divine eminence and all the Pentecostalism, all the charisma stuff, all this, I am the image of God and I'm a living image. And then we sit there and we think that we could take the place of Jesus Christ, and he's at the right hand of God mediating substitutionary righteousness. Anything that's manifest in us is corrupt and putrid and disqualifies us before God. It is a rancid scent under his nostrils. And the whole world is chasing after this ridiculous kind of inebriated, intoxicated, addled on some kind of a narco kind of dreamscape, thinking that we're all gods. And somehow our politics and our entertainment and our narratives are all a part of a great mind of the world, zeitgeist, participation in those narratives. What a golem we are creating. That's going to be, because you never can break down the image. There just comes a point where the image becomes so big, Frankenstein becomes so huge, Godzilla and King Kong become so huge that you can't control it. And it becomes the means of your own destruction. It happens all throughout image empowerment stories. AI is that God. It's not the only version of it, but it's a great, great identifier and a what's what we're looking for. It's a great marker. So, kind of wrap it up. This is where this abomination that causes desolation, there's no repentance. There is the heartless forehead. All image monsters that get out of control are numb to its own introspection and self-reflection. Frankenstein, King Kong, and Godzilla don't look at themselves. They're just out of control. And so what do you have? You have the deification, the celebration, and the institutionalization of pride, of zero introspection of self and self-insight. The same perverted rage and self-deification in which you have a murderous spirit. Why a murderous spirit? We talked about this on our studies. Because murder is a function, not murder, but the death decree is a function of God. Cain distributed the most extreme version of God. He killed for transgression. Lamech says, I did it for the slice of insult. Look how empowered I will be as I go out into the wilderness and demonic powers will visit me and they will share their technology. I'll call them the what is it, Anunnakis, but they're Anak. These are the fallen ones that are now engaged with human beings and imparting. Right, you have the thinning out of the two dimensions where you have fallen angels that are now demonic powers, now handing over these great insights and brilliance and technology and sciences and mathematics and metaphysical concepts to human beings that were traveling out in the desert, in the wasteland. And it was a great temptation to Cain when he did that and he built Enoch, the city. You think that was all just from his creative imagination? He went up to the wilderness and was tempted, and Satan said, I can make you a great kingdom. If you bow down and worship me, I'll hand the entire kingdom to you, and you'll never have to hunger for food again. It'll be an interdependent city system. All Christ went through out of that wilderness temptation is what Cain went through, what Ham went through when he himself couldn't bear, and it has this kind of rapey, molesting kind of a thing in which you are subverting authority, just like Ham did. You have this brand new heaven and earth, and it's all in this form of this wilderness form after the flood and the wrath of God and the destruction. And he, quote, looks upon his father, and then he now shames his father, looks upon his father's nakedness. And what did he do? He subverted the authority of his father by whatever, as you could see in Leviticus 18 and 20, in which he did the Oedipus thing. That's why I was bringing up all the Oedipus stuff. It's the spirit of man is now catching on. America was humble. America had that humility. America was non-interventionalist. America now sees itself as essential, and it is now a new world order that has to be throughout the entire world, and sees itself as essential and will do anything to hold on to its power, and will exhibit the same spirit as Cain, the same, will not take reproof, will not have introspection, the same spirit as what you saw with Lamech, in which he instructed his two wives in building up his whole narrative. God destroys that. That's now rebirthed in Ham. And he becomes a Cushite. He becomes Sheba. He becomes Babylon. He becomes Assyria. He becomes all the great nations that's coming from Ham. The spirit of man, this mentality. And the second it creeps in to the people of God, the sons of God, people that are in covenant with God, it is now an abomination that will cause their desolation. So they start jumping over the fires of Molech. They start currying and trying to be, like a harlot chasing after a man, wanting all of these Ham-like powers to love her and to make deep, passionate love to her. And God was likening his people to a prostitute and a whore that was so whorish that she was paying them to apostatize. And that was the reason for the abomination of desolation. And America and apostate protestantism and the church are so absolutely down for this. COVID told us anything we ever needed to know about this. Okay, we're only going to go for about 15 more minutes. But this is a synopsis. Hey, good to see you, Nathan. The spirit of Nimrod. Worship me, deify me. Man and beast, image, worship. And God judges that. Sodom and Gomorrah, God judges that. Nimrod, Tower of Babel, God judges that. Nebuchadnezzar, God judges it with Belteshazzar. Judges that. God forbid that the people of God should adopt such a spirit. America was meant to be as a refuge, as a kind of Eretz, a Canaan land in which you had the natives were there and they were driven out and they're brought into subjugation. And then the land of the United States was to be a type of Israel in that sense, in a pragmatic sense, for all practical reasons. Now we've apostatized as much as Israel has ever apostatized. So, ultimately, what am I saying here? This is how we're going to wrap up our thoughts at this point. If you missed some of this, go from the very beginning. America is being played out. See, eschatology now overlaps not just one line of prophecy, doesn't just identify one thing through one line of time prophecy. Now you're going to have to look for characteristics. You have now the Solomonic kingdom, in which there was this great prosperity and brought peace to all over the world, liberated slaves, etc. Done its own in-house reform that it had to do, became a great influential power throughout the entire world, and then starts to apostatize. And it happens politically, it happens through its social structure, but it also starts to be a joint venture of a theological and the spiritual joining that the Church of Rome had done with Justinian in America. And so our foreign policy, I brought this up in other American prophecy studies, are fascinatingly Zionistic. That is a prophetic view. That is a theological, doctrinal view. The greatest miracle in our present day has nothing to do with the Balfour Agreement and Rothschild and all the shenanigans and all the World War stuff and all the transfer agreements working with Zionism and Hitler and all the various ways in which Winston Churchill was involved and all the nasty weirdness that was happening even from Russia. Why was Russia on our side and everything else? And you will look that this was this whole idea of trying to, through manipulation and through artificial means, create this, quote, Israel, and bringing all the Abrahamic religions together back in Israel to create this kind of dominionism, the Abrahamic religions all coming together. And that's why the United States of America is so linked in to Israel and the Middle East. It's theological. Yeah, it's certainly not secular. Why was the United States like instrumental in developing Al Qaeda? Why are they taking the Afghan rebels and then developing them and forming them, helping them to fight the Russians, and then moving them into Yugoslavia and Sarajevo to really fine-tune this kind of mercenary Islamic army? What's going on here? These are all medieval tactics. The United States of America have completely bought into and subscribed to all of medievalism in its most, and all the tricks and all the various dirty play that it partakes in, including through economics and everything else, if you want to get into the history of it. We've made this clear in our studies. You're going to have to kind of be multidisciplined in just looking at these things. And so, yeah, there was a Persia element to us. Yeah, there is a Solomnistic element to us. Yeah, absolutely. As we keep kind of looking onto these things. This is what's happening now. The whole world at some point is going to have to be in rebellion to the law of God in an official institutional way. When it's institutionalized, when it becomes something that joins in with global power, when you have, quote, like the law that shows dominion, the law of the 10 Commandments that shows full dominion, and the reign of the territory of God is the Sabbath. And the whole not buy nor sell is about Sabbath reform and the severity of Sabbath reform, but Satan's counterfeit of it. And so we talked about why it would be a, quote, Sunday law, because all the kingdoms of this world are united with the idea of the word dominion, and dominion comes from the sun of the fourth day of creation. And this is where all of the Cain, Lamech, you had Ham, Nimrod, Assyria, they're all sun signs. All the way to the Native Americans, you have the swastika and everything else, all the way from India. Why do they have all these? The swastika is a sun sign. It's the idea of progress or process, and that's why you see these little streaks coming from this plus sign. It's the idea of wheels moving in what's called process or progress or progressivism or process theology. A thing's progress, and the sun has a way of breaking and destroying things down and then creating this kind of phoenix of rebirth. Nazism is built on this idea. You have communism is built on this idea. You had an entire century of hundreds of millions of people dying based on these kind of pragmatically played out philosophies to create this thing that we now call globalism. Globalism. Yeah, the black sun. What's fascinating about this black sun concept is that's where you get the secret societies, where you get the hidden hand, because they believe that they're the black sun, that the sun is this idea of dominion and destruction and deconstructionism and rebirth in life. So all the kingdoms of this world are mimicking this idea of being gods and having dominion. And because that's what you get, the fourth day of creation was an image of the first day. You see, the first 3 days are the original. That's why Christ is in the tomb for 3 days. He's the original, he's the antitype. And then the next other 3 days, which completes the 6-day cycle, mirrors day 1, 2, and 3. 4, 5, and 6 mirrors or images this. And that's where you have sun, moon, and stars. You have man and beast and fowl and bird and all this other kind of stuff. These are now images and mimicries. And everything that's on this earth is this concept of having dominion and rule, just like when God says, I should have dominion over you. This whole sun worship, sun sign power, and these gods of this age and the whole Cain and Ham mentality that's gone into the entire world is the spirit adopted from Satan saying, you will not have dominion over me, said Cain, said Ham, said Lucifer, said Judas, says whoever. Hopefully it's not you, brother, sister. Hopefully it's not me. Let us submit. Let us have reproof. Let us not be Laodicean. Let us not be rich in increase of goods, have need of nothing, hence Babylon, hence Assyria, hence Egypt, hence all the great nations that were self-sufficient, couldn't be touched by God. Hence, that was the whole idea of Jericho. And God says, yeah, you will be touched. You will be touched. Tower of Babel, you will be touched. Egypt, you will be touched. Assyria, you better repent or you will be touched. And Jonah was sent and they repented. And what's so fascinating is that we're going to have to bow down and to the judges of Nineveh that all repented, because they're going to be accusing us, saying, why didn't you repent? I thought you were God's people. What's wrong with you that you cannot receive reproof, chastisement, discipline, correction, and with great humility and shamefacedness? Why is our reaction to double down and say, oh yeah, well, you're not going to rule over me? That's the spirit of Satan, of Cain, of Lamech, of Ham, of all the Cushites, of the heart of man and rebellion that is truly embedded in the soul of human beings. And we have now codified it, deified it, and looking to establish a dominion principle on this world to create this Eden, Garden of Eden, that we will own nothing and all be happy and will be under the dominion, the rule of men, to be worshiped as gods, Bill Gates or whoever, Elon Musk, however it plays, and these dynasty families. We're all moving backwards in time, you guys. We're not moving forward. We're moving backwards. This is regression. This is retro. This is a retro process, retroactive process. This is important to understand. All right, guys, that's all we're going to do for the study today, but this is the synopsis. So if you kind of are saying, well, I don't really know where we're going with this, and Dave, how can I kind of condense all this and kind of bring it all into a concise, maybe a synoptic form of this, a synopsis, maybe, you could boil it down. Come back to this video. This will reorientate you, because ultimately Satan wants us to adopt his own heart, whether it is nationally, whether it is globally, whether it is congregationally, whether it is in your state or your community or in your family or in the privacy of your own heart, or whatever fantasies you attach yourself by the things you watch, by the things you listen to, or by the ideas you subscribe to and the things you mimic, by the things that you speak and you have fellowship with. Know that this is at war with God. Those that submit to God, because this is the last thing that I'll touch on, is the second commandment is about image versus commandment keeping. And the book of 1 John is about commandment keeping, and be careful of images. Because you can basically set up a God in your mind, and God will have to fulfill all the expectations that you put in this frozen image in which you're saying, God, if you're not this, I don't want you. And you set up an image of God. And then you comfort and warm yourself with that image. It says that those images drove them insane. Look at the prophets of Baal that were on Mount Carmel, all the way to the judgment that happened to God's people throughout Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah. It says their images made them insane because of what? Because of transference, because of projection, because of these expectations in which you have it set up in your mind. This is how it should be. And this is how it should play out. And this is how God should be. And I have put God in this category, and he needs to remain that, or I will go cuckoo. I will go nuts. I will rage against the machine that you created. But God says, I'm a living God. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Following his commandments is more than just a frozen code somewhere. He will tell you to do things that is antithetical to your dreams. God will crush all of your image worship. God will disappoint. God will literally go to war with your dreams, with your aspirations and ambitions, because it just might be too dangerous for you because you are setting up a self-deification path. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God that commands in a absolute, in the moment, disrupts us, interrupts us. How much did God interrupt the Tower of Babel building? How much did God interrupt through the prophets the plans that were made for the greatness of Israel? And God says, ah. And it is incumbent upon you to obey and to submit yourself to how God sends you. If God sends you to go to a brook that is barely trickling out water and being fed by ravens, and everyone else is eating like kings, and there's like 10 Costco's in Jerusalem, and everyone has like, $500 gift card, or you're going to follow God and you're going to be outside the camp, outside the gate, but you are a commandment keeper. Because with it, wherever he tells you to go, he will be there. It's following the Lamb. It is a shepherd that leads. He dwells amongst the lilies. He goes to the valley of the shadow of death. And you could be in full disobedience to God and be like Jericho and have all the grain pots filled. And you are like, he can't touch me. You could be a Pharaoh. God can't touch me. You could be a Nebuchadnezzar. God can't touch me. You could be a Sennacherib. God can't touch me. You could be the Titanic. God can't touch me. I've already got too much of a buffer zone. He can't touch me. And that's the mind of Ham. That is the mind of Cain. You can't touch me. I will fortify myself, and you can't touch me. And you have just set yourself in array and war against God. You have challenged God. You have thrown down the gauntlet, and you said, I dare you. I'm daring heaven to go to war with me. We become Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, Sodom and Gomorrah will fare better. It's this hearing of the gospel, coming under the commands of God, coming into humility, discipline, chastisement, reconstruction to a broken, humble, commandment-keeping wife that does not listen to the commands of Satan, but defers self-gratification and impulse control and waits patiently for her husband. All right, guys, that's it for now, but that's a basic synopsis, and I'm going to keep it an hour, so it's a doable thing. I know most of my teachings are 2.5 hours. So this is that hour to go back and kind of do a reset, a recheck, and go, oh, okay, I got to recalibrate where David's going there. Man, he was going off about Oedipus, or he was going off about Ham and the kings of the earth, and I kind of lost where we were going in American prophecy. Believe me, we are now seeing the image of what medievalism was trying to accomplish through the American hegemony, and with the help of the church and its entire kind of concept that this new world was a model for the new world entirety of the entire globe, that it was the template for the rest of the globe. And our endeavors and attempts to do that have created more evil through how we develop Al-Qaeda, how we have sponsored terrorism, why we pull out of Afghanistan, and we leave hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment and all stuff there. Now, you have Afghanistan we did it before. We did in Benghazi and other things. We do this whole, we left all of our stuff here. Oh, it ended up in the market creating global terrorism. That's weird. Medieval? Can anyone say? Anyway. All right, guys, keep me in prayer. Keep this ministry in prayer. Keep my health in prayer. Keep my mental faculties in prayer. And then start learning these things. You become an avenue in which God is sharing these things. Guys, we are in the last days. The image is being set up. We're at war with God. Everything you need to know about the church, you were told during COVID. The word COVID, right, means what? Coronavirus. This is about kingdoms. This is about kings. This is about dominion. This is about those that are children of the Son or children under the canopy of Christ. This is children of wrath versus the children and the sons of God, the daughters of God. These are those that are in under the rod and chastisement of an eternal king versus those joining in kind of likeness to an image. And everything about Nimrod and everything about the star power and everything about the worship and everything about this murderous intrigue of mafia style in which we're just sitting there just strangely enchanted with all these bigger than life people is only reflecting of the desperate fantasies of our own self-deification and delusion. That's going to be deified. All right, guys? Anyway, that's it. Hour's up. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you, and